Um, bon, this is just en français. As you can tell, I don't speak very well French. Hi, I'm Cactus Raazi from B2C2, and we at B2C2 have spent a fair amount of time over the past roughly 18 months building out a bunch of stablecoin infrastructure. And when I was asked whether there would be something interesting to talk about here, I thought it might be most helpful to the audience to go through the actual building of a corridor and some of the complexities. There's a lot of permutations. I'll try to keep this reasonably brief and to the point, but I just wanted to mention that there's a fair amount of, kind of writing on the internet and various other things about how fast stablecoins are going to be and how easy, and you sort of just snap your fingers and you move money all over the world instantly for no money, free and instant. And while hopefully that'll be the future at some future date, that's certainly not the case right now. We are huge fans of the entire stablecoin, kind of let's call it the paradigm and the movement towards stablecoins particularly within payments and in other use cases as well. But we wanted to just share some of our actual learnings and some of our actual difficulties building out a specific corridor. So, this is kind of, this slide is, I won't really read the slides, but just to mention the fact that obviously the world thinks that stablecoins, and we agree that stablecoins are going to become a really dominant paradigm for the movement of value, both within networks. An example of that might be Stripe with what they've done recently with Bridge and moving money around their own merchant network, and then obviously both within regions and then cross-border, hopefully from point A to point B anywhere in the globe, much faster and much cheaper than what is currently available. Now the issue, in my experience, is that these corridors need to be built out with really specific thought. The actual kind of stablecoin movement is obviously quite easy. Just move something around on chain, no problem, send it to a wallet. But it's the things around it that we want to mention where the complexity is. This is really the full stack of a fully built corridor. So you've got everything from the bank where the person wanting to send money generally has to go to a bank. Why is that? Generally for KYC reasons. You've got an FX conversion from the local currency, in this example, BRL, to US dollar. You've got the deposit of dollars in some sort of an account that we would have to have control over. The conversion of those dollars to stablecoin is obviously very easy. On-chain transfer, obviously very easy, but then the complexity comes up on the back end as well. In this example, which is a real-world example of us, we have clients in Brazil who want to send money to Japan. And in this example then also in Japan, there's a fair amount of complexity. You've got off-ramping, you've got another FX leg there, and then finally the ability for someone to pull the money out of the bank. Putting the money in the bank to start this process and pulling the money out of the bank to end this process almost always involve at a minimum KYC and compliance. And in addition to that, there can be other considerations such as sanction checks, and we'll get into some of those in a minute. So a couple of things here that is rarely mentioned. Usually when we build these corridors out, we go from a local partner. In Brazil, we have multiple local banking relationships such as, well, maybe I shouldn't mention them necessarily, but there's a number of banks that we work with down there, and we get good FX there. Why do I mention this? For anyone in the audience or anyone listening to this, you should also consider working, in addition to your local partners on both ends of the corridor, consider working with a money center bank. The hard part of working with a money center bank, in our case specifically it's JP Morgan, is getting onboarded. It took us 18 months to get onboarded to JP Morgan. It's a pretty high threshold, both from a compliance perspective as well as suitability in terms of whether you have the necessary scale to be sort of worth it to an organization that large. But while I will walk through what we do with local partners in both regions, I want to point out that a lot of what I'm saying won't necessarily be necessary if you have a money center bank relationship. Other examples, we have banking at DBS, at Standard Chartered, Bank of New York. So there are multiple examples of these large kind of global banking entities. For this specific corridor, one of the things we can do is we can go through what we're going to talk about today. But the other thing we can actually do is if our Brazilian client wants to deposit money in our account in Brazil, it can very quickly be registered as yen in Japan, using a JP Morgan methodology rather than doing all the other things I'm talking about. So I sort of just want to point that out as it's not available to all companies, and it doesn't work always. Obviously, if you're in parts of the world that are heavily underbanked, moving away from Brazil, using examples, for example, arbitrarily the Democratic Republic of Congo, you're going to have a much bigger problem. They happen to be under sanctions as well. But the reason why KYC AML on this slide is highlighted is specifically because that's one of the things that's so often glossed over in a lot of the literature on LinkedIn, or what you might see these, it's quite fashionable to release a really fat report about how stablecoins are going to change the world, which hopefully they will. But the KYC is pretty heavy on both sides, just FYI, particularly if there's a dollar leg, which with the state of the affairs with stablecoins currently, usually, not always, but usually involves a dollar leg. This slide is only to point out that there's another interesting dynamic. There are a lot of really well-built, trustworthy, first-class stablecoins out there. We are currently still seeing the majority of our demand currently in USDT Tether, USDC Circle. We are a member of the Global Dollar Network, and we do also encourage our clients to look at USDG, which is issued from Paxos. There are obviously quite a number of newer stablecoins that I am a believer in, including the Western Union stablecoin, the Fidelity stablecoin. Obviously, PayPal has quite a useful asset out there as well. But I wanted to point out that, we're at ECC, so I should point out the vast majority of our activity is on Ethereum, that's for sure. We do get occasional requests for Solana or more recently Canton for the privacy features, but heavily dominant is Ethereum, and coin-wise currently heavily dominant USDT Tether, USDC Circle, but with a lot of attractive additional options that I think over the course of the next 24 months will start to become more common. And then finally, just a little bit on risk management. That's not an area that people talk about all that often, but to have a robust corridor built out that, in addition to KYC and some of the other table stakes we've briefly gone over, what your risk management protocols are, what your sort of vulnerability to either bad actors such as hacking, but more commonly just operational errors. Those are things that will also need to be thought of. At our firm and at a number of larger firms, there is a whole set of checks and balances, authorizations depending on the size of the transaction, and various other methodologies, including multi-signer frameworks to ensure that, well, not to ensure, but to absolutely minimize the possibility of an operational error or a bad actor. And so here's just a little bit around the compliance leg. The compliance leg is interesting for a couple of reasons. For one, it's obviously pretty slow. And unlike the front office, where those of us in the business, we want to do sexy things and move big amounts of money and show how fast we can do things, our partners in compliance rarely share the same motivation, with all due respect. If anyone in this audience is in compliance, they are much more interested in protecting the firm, protecting the client, protecting reputation, and most importantly, not getting into an uncomfortable situation with a regulator or an auditor. So I just wanted to point out that these considerations, when you're building your corridor, when you're thinking about, okay, I have a lot of clients in geography A, and there's a heavy interest in moving money from geography A arbitrarily to geography B, wherever that may be. These kinds of considerations, what bank am I going to use, who are my local partners going to be, and what are their, do they have adherence to some of the rules that I'm going to need to adhere to myself? Are they going to be good partners for compliance? It is actually an important part of the conversation. Now, this part, converting stablecoins to local currency, obviously the stablecoin to dollar conversion is not an issue whatsoever. We don't need to talk about that. But I did want to mention a little bit around FX. In our experience, regardless of the geography, what I'm about to say is true in Brazil. It's less true in Japan because that's quite a developed FX market. But in many, many geographies that we've looked at in Latin America, which is my area of focus, given my role is to look after the Americas, you get wide divergence of pricing on the FX. And so that's another element of your local banking partners that you'll need to be thoughtful about, is pre-negotiating your FX rates. We actually have an FX partner who offers us terrific FX on both sides as kind of part and parcel of our broad global relationship. But for those of you who are trying to build out something specific, for example, Paraguay to the Philippines, just to pick two arbitrary countries, you're going to want to ensure that up front you've negotiated very kind of aggressively your FX rates on both sides to ensure that the corridor that you're trying to build actually creates value for your users. And then settlement in the recipient country is also not, it is not a trivial matter. For example, the sort of arbitrary example I'm using is Japan. Most Japanese banks are very slow on the payouts, like kind of 24 plus hours. They're also, in my experience has been they're not particularly motivated to get involved in this business necessarily. It's kind of like brain damage that they don't really want, and they don't want to have to think about, the nature of the flows and the fact that there was a stablecoin in there somewhere and whatnot. So finding partners that are going to be good, motivated partners, and who are going to sort of understand that every step along this corridor of those many steps a few slides ago need to be as fast as possible for this thing to create value. I should also just point out on a side note that Brazil has a tax. It's a currency control tax, essentially, on moving money out of Brazilian real into any G7 currency, such as a US dollar, and it's 38 basis points. That doesn't kill the corridor, but I want to point out that is a very important consideration. There are some mechanisms to reduce the impact of that tax, which we can talk about offline, but conceptually, these are other considerations that aren't necessarily obvious at the beginning when you say to yourself, oh, I've got a great bank and I've got some great FX. But again, you have to sort of almost like map out this entire corridor from start to finish and ensure you've built in all the costs and chiseled down as many of them as possible to ensure that what you're offering your clients is going to ultimately be useful. On the subject of clients, I might point out that we work closely with a number of the well-known stablecoin orchestration firms who are, all over LinkedIn or all over the press for having been, either acquired or having, created exciting partnerships and whatnot. We also work closely with stablecoin native financial services. And so there are companies that encourage stablecoin native financial services sort of as a back end. Companies like Rain, you may have heard of, that are focused on cards. There's companies like Cast with a K, who are issuers and maintain accounts really in a stablecoin native way. And a lot of what we do is to help these types of clients, orchestration or stablecoin native financial services, take advantage of the technology and and somehow navigate some of the complexities we've talked about, such as local partners, FX rates, compliance considerations, and in some cases tax or other exogenous factors. On this slide, it does mention also operational reality. I wanted to point out that for us, we're lucky. We're owned, I don't know if we're lucky about this, but we are in fact owned by a Japanese company, and because of that, we're lucky to have strong operational capabilities in Japan. In this example being, of course, sending money from Brazil to Japan. The point, though, is that you're going to want to be thoughtful about what your operational capabilities are at the recipient end of the corridor that you're building, because without them, you're going to end up having significant problems if there were to be some sort of, for example, maybe the next block is slow on the chain you're using, and someone's sort of freaking out about where their money is. God knows what the issue might be, but it's really helpful to have a robust ops function. I'm not necessarily saying a ton of people, I'm saying a small number of good people and good systems and a good level of automation on both ends. As it says here, the lesson is that the final mile is oftentimes where your corridor breaks down, and in this example, we would, one of the examples we would have is it took us quite some time to find the right banking partner outside of our money center bank, which I spoke about previously. It took us quite some time to find the right banking partner in Japan, and I think that'll be the case in a lot of jurisdictions where you might be sending money. On a side note, we get a lot of requests for sending money onshore China, which we cannot do. We don't have that corridor built out, but I just thought it's just an interesting kind of proof point for anyone in this room. That is going to be something, as you go about building corridors, you're going to get that request really quickly. It's really common. And so this is just a list of best practices. I don't necessarily know that I need to read this list of best practices, but what I do need to say is that you can see there's quite a bit there. It's, as I've said previously, it is important to really sit down and think about every step of your corridor, where you can do better, what are you missing. There's obviously compliance by design there. The next bullet down is about engaging regulators and being transparent about what it is that you're doing and why, what is the nature of the flows. I might also add, by the way, that we also get pretty common for us to get requests from totally random companies that we've never heard of, that are typically LLCs in the United States. Typically, a couple of the people that are the principals of the company have like an ex-military, military contractor background, and then they want to move some money from typically somewhere in Africa to somewhere in Asia, and want to work with us to do the stablecoin leg. And you wouldn't believe how intense the compliance issues there are, and the KYB, and obviously a whole bunch of AML, and then we've bounced into sanctions issues in the past as well. So as you start to build this stuff out and put a shingle out in the marketplace, you will get a lot of, let's just call it surprising calls, some of which might be legitimate, and a lot of which will probably be better left alone. Last thing on this slide is automation. That's just one other thing I want to mention. One of the things we did is we said to ourselves, payments companies specifically are going to have a large number of small transactions. Unlike trading firms and large institutions that obviously do multi-million-dollar transactions day in and day out, and that's very common for us. What was less common and what's more common these days is working with payments companies and doing hundreds and in some case thousands of little transactions all the way down to single digit dollars and up to, let's say, $500,000. And that is all automated at our firm. So we have a variety of different mechanisms to do fully automated movement. And then also one of the things we offer is a platform called Penny. And we've built this platform specifically for payments sizes, that is to say more like retail size transactions, where it's fully automated, it's instant, it's costless, and it is an atomic swap basically, where you send us the stablecoin that you want to sell, and you receive the stablecoin that you want to buy. And so Penny was conceived as effectively a central facility for anyone that wants to accept most stablecoins, but only settle in a couple because they have their preferred treasury asset. So Penny allows our clients to go out to the marketplace and say, we accept them all, and then just quickly use the platform that's instant, as I said, no counterparty risk, and settle in their preferred asset. And where do we go from here? I mean, we definitely have, in my region, we definitely have regulatory tailwinds. We've built out a good infrastructure. I think that the move towards using stablecoins to move money around, both domestically and internationally, is still very early days. Obviously, stablecoin natives, financial services, and financial products are still also very early days. And programmability in terms of putting software on top of these stablecoins, also very early days. So I think a really bright future. And my caution to the audience is move fast, but definitely pay attention to some of the kind of annoying compliance and regulatory matters that we brought up, because getting tripped up in that is going to really kill your momentum. I think that's it. Thank you.